The smoking gun is coming up. It's just brutal. Now, I am going to refine these charts a little bit. He's going to get full credit. His name is going to be on everything because this is not me at all. I am just going to show you the case that he made. So stay with me here because it's not going to require really a whole lot of math, but the way he's got it laid out, I think it can be improved on just a little bit. So let's start with picture number 1. Okay, there they are, the two patriots who've come up with this. So here's what happens. In many places, including in Michigan, all of this data is for Michigan. There are 2 ways to vote, legally 2 ways to vote. You can vote individually, in other words, I vote for Trump for president, then you go down the ballot and you do that, or you can elect to go all Democrat or all Republican. That is a legal way to vote in many precincts, in many counties, many states. So you can basically just say, oh, look, I don't want to waste any time. I'm just going to vote Republican. And if you vote Republican, it goes all the way down the ticket Republican and so on. Now, some people do that and other people go down the ballot individually. Most people go down the ballot individually. But I want you to take a look at this chart here. Again, I would do this a little bit differently, but in any event, if you look at the red line that's at 0%, that red line represents what the straight party ticket votes. So if you were to get nothing but people who voted all Republican, didn't do the individual votes, just went all ticket Republicans, that straight line would be the straight Republican Party score for people who vote Republican. And they're not making a choice on Donald Trump on this. This is the important part to understand. That red line represents people who go in and vote Republican down the ticket. Now, anything above that line, in the case of the blue dot, it's 5% above the line. That blue dot is a blue square is a precinct, and that precinct is showing 5% above the line. What that means is that for that particular precinct, 5% of the people who went down individually voted for Donald Trump heavier than the straight Republican vote. In other words, the best way to think of that is that 5% above the line represents Democrats or independents who may have voted differently, may have voted Democrat, but switched their vote just for Trump. So anything that's above that red line is Trump doing better than straight down the ticket Republican, automatic all Republican vote. Anything below that line is Trump doing worse than straight Republican vote. So any data point above that red line can be interpreted to mean that that represents people who may have voted Democrat but made a vote for Trump and so on. And likewise, if it's below the line, that could represent Republicans who went in there and voted Republicans except for Trump. And this is the case that Romney and the others are trying to make, is that Trump lost because Republicans lost faith in him and they just didn't vote for him. So anything above that line is a net gain over the straight 50-50 vote, which is the red line. So the red line is how people vote. I'm a Republican. That's what the line is. People who decide to fill in their own vote, if there are more people who vote for Trump than just the straight Republican votes, you get above the line. If less people, then below the line. Now begins the fun. So, looking at this data, each one of those blue squares is a precinct. This would be a normal case situation. In other words, in a completely unfraudulent vote count, this is what you would expect to see. The numbers across the bottom, by the way, are the percentage of Republican votes. So, on the far left of the margin, that far left blue dot, that means what, maybe 5% of the votes went to the Republicans and 95 went to the Democrats. But of the 5% that went Republican, some 2% of them went higher to Trump than just straight Republican. But in any event, this is what a normal case would look like. This should be pretty clear. Some are above the line, some are below the line. That's a normal deviation. That's what we'd expect to see. If you saw this, what this would tell you is that Trump is more popular than the average Republican votes. In other words, people who go in and vote just Republican vote the red line, But the blue dots above the red line means lots of people have gone in and voted up and down, different ways, but voted for Trump. This is what Democrats voting for Trump would look like. This is what it would look like if Democrats went out to vote, went straight ticket Democrat, except went to Donald Trump specifically for that particular thing. So this is what the graph would look like if Donald Trump was more popular among independents and had pulled a lot of Democratic votes. Inversely, if Mitt Romney's case were true, that people have lost faith in Donald Trump, then Donald Trump would be underperforming among Republicans. In other words, the average Republican down the ticket vote is the red line, but blue dots below the red line would mean that Republicans are actually leaving Donald Trump. They are voting for Biden. They're voting straight Republican ticket, but the blue dots mean they're voting for Biden. And the lower those dots are, the further away they are. So, for example, if you look at the one on the far right, bottom right-hand corner of the blue dots, that looks like roughly a 70% Republican majority. Look at the bottom line, bottom scale. If you look at the far right, bottom right-hand corner dot, that precinct is showing about 75% of the votes going to the Republicans. That's what the horizontal line means. But of the 75% of the Republican votes that were counted in that precinct won 75-25. But of the Republican votes in that bottom right-hand precinct, 10% of them were below. In other words, 10% of the voters who voted, not the automatic ticket, said, no, we don't like Trump. If those dots had been above the line, then they would like Trump. Okay, so that's how it works. Now let's look at some of the data coming back from Michigan. And I hope you're all sitting down because this just gets to be marvelous. These guys analyzed the data from the 4 most populous counties in Michigan. That'd be Oakland County, Macomb County, Kent County, and Wayne County. They took a look at the actual data that came in, both as early voting and on election day. So now prepare to have your minds blown. Again, I cannot stress this enough. Before I go to the next graph, this has to be clearly understood by everyone that this is not a projection. This is a point-by-point indication of the data that came back from the Michigan authorities as they authenticated the vote. So look at this. Next slide is Trump votes. Every blue square on the next line is an individual precinct, and I think we start in Oakland County. Okay, Oakland County early voting. Every blue square or diamond in this case is an individual precinct. Now, what is this telling us? Well, it's telling us something really, 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 really interesting. Start on the left-hand side of the graph, and then look at the bottom. You can see that on the far left dots, if you look at the bottom, those are precincts that went heavily Democrat in the total vote. If you look at those, that kind of bulge there at the very far left on the red line there, if you go straight down, you can see that those precincts went 95% Democrat. But even though they went 95% Democrat, they were in some cases 6, 7, 8% more for Trump than they would be for the straight Democratic ticket. That means that if you look at the left-hand side of the chart there, Trump does better than the straight Republican ticket in areas where he is least popular. But as the vote continues, if you look across the bottom line now, 20%, 40%, 60%, look at the 60% line. If you have a precinct that comes back 60% Republican, the Republicans win this precinct 60% to 40%. What that data shows is that the more Republican the precinct gets, the lower the support for Trump becomes. Trump is getting lower support as the precincts become more and more and more Republican. And that doesn't make much sense. But this graph doesn't make any sense. This graph should be a standard deviation, and it should match that horizontal line. In other words, more or less, people voting individually should vote for Trump in more or less the same numbers as the people that vote straight Republican, but that's not what it's showing. This is on early voting for Oakland County. Let's see what they did on election day. Hey, look at that. Now now what he's done is he's put a line in there indicating the slope of the line. If you average all the blue dots, they fall upon that yellow line. And now look at what's happening, because this is the smoking gun. Starting from the left on the yellow line, okay? I'm going to move the camera so I can see a little bit. Starting at the left on the yellow line, what you see is that in areas, go straight down to the bottom, that went heavily Democratic, areas where the Republicans won 5% of the vote, Donald Trump did 10% better. He's above the curve in the least Republican areas. And when you get to 20%, Republican voting, then all of a sudden that line cranks down at a steep angle. And that line continues down, meaning that as you get a higher and higher and higher percentage of Republican votes, Donald Trump gets less and less and less of that vote as a percentage against the straight Republican ticket. Let's go back and look at the previous one. There's the slope for early counting. There's the slope for election day. And look at that. It makes a perfectly straight yellow line. Look at the yellow line. It's normal. It's what you would expect to see. But when the percentages of Republican votes hit 20%, then as the vote becomes more and more Republican, Donald Trump does worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. He is least popular in the most heavily Republican precincts, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So let's look at what the rest of the guys are doing here. Here's Macomb County. Early voting on the left, election day voting on the right. You'll notice that the exact same thing is there, the same illogical, nonsensical thing, that he is up in areas that are most Democratic. He's way up there. If you look at the chart on the left for early voting, you're going to assume, given the demographics of the country, that the precincts with the smallest Republican votes are going to be the ones in the inner cities. But if you look at the ones on the far left, the blue dots on the far left under early voting, just look at early voting, look at the far left. What you see with those precincts is, yes, even though those precincts may have only come in with 10% of the Republican vote, he's getting 25%, 20% above what the straight Republican ticket means. Those mean that the poorer neighborhoods are going for Trump way above the line, way above what the average would be, which is the straight Republican down the ticket vote. And look at it again. Right when you get to about 20%, all of a sudden the line cranks down. And the more Republican votes come in, the less and less and less popular Donald Trump becomes as a function below the red line of the straight Republican ticket. Same thing for election day. Pretty much a horizontal line with normal distribution. But by the way, look at both of these things. The 50-50 Republican line is the red line. The blue squares are the actual voting districts. And if you look at both of those things, prior to that crank coming in, you can see that Trump is doing much, much, much better. Much better. In some cases, he's doing almost 40% better. If you look at election day on this one, it looks like he's 36, 37% above the straight Republican line. That means it's like something like 37% of Democrats have changed their votes for Trump only. And then once you get to about 20, 25% in the right-hand one, it looks like it kicks in around 40. But it's a sudden thing and happens, and then it goes down. And look at the slope. The slope is the angle of that yellow line. Look at the slope. It's a linear slope. And the slope on these two match that slope in terms of the angle. Look at the angle of the yellow line. There's the raw data. There's the slope data for Oakland County. There's the slope for Macon County. Let's look at the next one. Here's Wayne County. Sorry, that's not the one I wanted. I wanted to come back to that. Here's Kent County. Now, on this one, they have taken both early voting and election day voting and put them onto the same graph. But you can see that Trump is way above the line in areas that have poor Republican turnout. And once you get to about 25, 20%, somewhere in there, all of a sudden, Trump starts to do worse and worse and worse the more Republican the vote gets. And here is the point. Look at the slope of that line. Not only is he doing more poorly, but he's doing more poorly in a perfectly linear fashion. And that linear fashion is consistent across all of those counties that were in question. So if you look at Kent County, if you look at Macomb County, and if you look at Oakland County, you see that he is doing better among the least Republican neighborhoods, and right around 20% of the vote, when 20% of the people start voting Republican, then all of a sudden he does worse and worse and worse. And any of the blue dots below the line are votes that go to Biden, because that red line represents the straight down the ticket vote. I vote Republican, so Trump gets that vote. Any blue dots that are below the red line are people saying, no, I'm voting Republican, except for Trump. So every single blue dot you see below the line is a vote that was switched to Biden, and the further below the red line it is, the higher percentage of the votes that were switched to Biden. So I'm obviously going to have to clarify these charts a little bit, but you get the idea. Now, numbers don't look like this. These lines, these slopes just don't suddenly do that. Even if there was a smooth curve, it does not make sense that as you got more and more Republican, Donald Trump would do worse and worse. But they didn't even bother to put a curve in it. They didn't slowly increase it. Whatever that slope is, that thing kicks in at about 20%. Once the vote count gets to be 20% Republican in whatever precinct it is, once it gets to be above 20%, they start taking votes away from Trump. And that means adding them to Biden. And the more Republicans are voting, the more let me rephrase that, the more Republican each precinct goes, the more votes are being taken away. So this is where it gets really cool. So there's Oakland County, Macomb County, and Kent County. Same slope, same thing, kicking in at the same place. Now, take a look at this one. That's Wayne County. There's no evidence of an algorithm being applied here. And if you look at that red line is where the Republican straight ticket vote is. And that means that in Wayne County, virtually every single one of those precincts were positive for Trump. They're above the red line. And almost all of Trump's gains occurred in the poorest neighborhoods. Best way to think of this is as you move towards the right, if you look at the bottom, it's 10%, 20%, 30% of the vote. On the far end of that right line is a precinct that votes 100% Republican. Far left end of the line is a precinct that votes 100% Democrat. And Trump is more ahead in the poorer neighborhoods than he is in the richer ones. You can see that the slope line here is that Donald Trump is doing 10% better all across the board. The line doesn't bend, it doesn't crank, it doesn't crack. It's just plain straight. That's what that means. What have we got here? Yeah. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that these electronic voting machines have an algorithm. And an algorithm that kicks in, and it kicks in at a specific point. It doesn't gradually kick in. It kicks in at a specific point, and once it kicks in, then it is automatically transferring votes from Trump to Biden, and the more votes Trump gets, the more votes get shifted. That's what that downward slope below the line means. The more Republican votes that come in, the more Republican votes get shifted. So of all of the counties where his total vote were stolen, most of the votes were stolen in the most Republican counties. And that actually kind of makes sense, because if you've got a lot more Trump votes than Biden votes, you don't really miss him as much. So the chance of this happening statistically is zero. There's zero chance of this happening statistically, none. And the beautiful thing about this is that that slope and the cutoff point is virtually identical, not only in time, but in space, meaning that in each one of these three counties, that correction comes in at the same place in terms of the percentage of votes, and it starts swapping votes in a linear fashion at the same slope. But not only does it take place in the same place, in other words, this county and that county and this county are all showing the same exact statistical anomaly going in the exact same direction, but it's also happening over time as well, meaning that the early votes are being cranked that way, as well as the election day votes being cranked that day. And that is just plain incontrovertible evidence. That's it. There's nothing else. There is no explanation for this. It is impossible. But there it is. So people talk about things like the software Dominion and so on. So what does this actually happen mechanically? This blew my mind more than just about anything. I don't know if you knew this or not. But when, again, I owe this all to these patriots, and they're going to get all the credit I can possibly stack on them. What these guys told me in this video, which again I'll link to, he said that going back to 2001, the first electronic voting machines were Diebold, and they came out in 2001, right after the 2000 election. And Diebold was the first, and then all of these other companies started getting into electronic voting, and Dominion is just one of them and probably the most popular one. I hope you're sitting down, because I think this was more disturbing to me than the statistical analysis. But from the first time that electronic voting was implemented in the first Diebold voting machines, provisions were made in the software to weight the vote. And what that means is you could make an adjustment in the software to say that if you got a vote from a black person, you would count that as 2 votes. The argument being that since blacks don't vote as often as whites, all you have to do is sample the blacks that do vote, and then you can extrapolate that number out. That weighting algorithm is built into all of these things. And so it's not like they have to add code to it. You can basically dial in the vote and say, well, this neighborhood is much more heavily black, so any votes that we get from this precinct, we're going to count as double. And any votes that we get from this white precinct, we're going to count as half. It's not one person, one vote. It's built into the software. Now, it can be turned on or off. I don't know what the case is with that, but the fact is it's built into the Diebold software, and it's built into all of the software. You can weight the vote. You can say, well, if it's a black precinct, since fewer people are showing up, this is the argument these criminals use, we're going to count every black vote as 1.3 votes. And every white vote, we're going to count as 0.7 votes, just to make it fair. I've got this. I've got it downloaded. Everybody's got it downloaded. So the mechanism for doing the weighting is in there. It's not like you have to write new code for this. Basically, all you have to do is essentially tell the algorithm, once it gets above 20%, then assume that these are white votes and black votes, and start taking the votes away from the whiter it gets, the more votes you take away. It's built into the system. Yeah, there is no explanation for it. There's no explanation for it. And the other guy who's, I don't have their names, I will have it by next time. The guy who was doing a lot of the data analysis. The great thing about this video is they do their very best to be as fair as possible. Could this happen naturally? And the guy says, no, I can't say that. Well, what's the chance of it happening naturally? He says, I can't say it's 0% because there's always some fraction of a percent possible that something can happen, but the closest whole number is 0% chance that this could happen. So he said, well, how do we know that this isn't a natural occurrence? In other words, maybe this is just the way it goes. Maybe there is some kind of social thing going on where once you get to be in more and more Republican votes, more and more Republican areas, precincts, support for Trump goes down. And the guy said, yes, it's true, that theoretically true. He said that that hatred for Trump could increase the more Republican you get. He said, but that hatred wouldn't fall in a perfect line. The hate wouldn't be in a perfect line. The hate wouldn't be at the same slope. And the hate wouldn't be the same slope in the same place at different precincts at different times. There's no way that this is actual what happened. But these are the numbers from Michigan. This is not like, well, this is what we're estimating. These are the numbers that were reported from Michigan. It is physically impossible that this didn't happen. And it happened so systematically, and it happened at exactly the same rate, at pretty much the same cutoff point. Once we start to get 20%, once more than 1 out of 5 people start voting for Republican, we got to start taking votes away from Republicans. If we get to the point where 4 out of 5 people are voting Republican, then we have to take even more votes away from Republicans. And that's how they did it in Michigan. And I'd be willing to bet you, if you looked at the other data, you would find that is true everywhere else as well. So what does this mean? Well, if you saw my first firewall, and of course all of you did, then you understand that the first thing that's going on is this business of saying that Joe Biden is president-elect. And if he's president-elect, that means that any attempt by Donald Trump to do this legally would be stealing the vote. They've been prepping this for the whole 4 years. Will Trump leave power? Will Trump leave the White House if he loses the election? Well, what they're going to say is he lost the election. It's going to go to the Supreme Court. They're going to say that's why he loaded up the courts, that he could cheat himself out of, cheat the people out of the will of the people. And we're going to hear nothing but this. But I think we're going to find this kind of thing in virtually everywhere. And the most important individual piece of data here, let me see if I can go back and find it again. The one that really, really does matter the most is this one. This is Wayne County, where they did not apply the algorithm for whatever reason. Maybe they didn't own the particular election official in Wayne County, or maybe the guy just forgot to turn on the cheat button. For whatever reason, this appears to be a normal statistical analysis, the kind of thing that you would see. But the thing that's so striking about this is, again, I'm generalizing. I don't mean to generalize, but we have to speak in a language that the left speaks in. The further left you go on this chart, the smaller the percentage of Republican votes. In this country, in Michigan, that means inner city neighborhoods with a higher proportion of blacks. But the thing that's so incredible about this data, this uncorrupted, the one of the 4 counties that's uncorrupted, is that the poorer people get, the more support for Trump there is. All of those blue dots above the line are indicating that on some of those things, I mean, you look at some of those dots, the highest dot there, I see 60%. That means that in this relatively poor neighborhood that's getting maybe 7% total Republican votes, it's 93-7, but of the 7, many of those votes, 60% of them, are coming from former Democrats. Which means that, I think what it means is that if we see these patterns across the country, and I'm sure we will, it means that Trump won by a huge landslide. And that when I say the beauty, there's nothing beautiful about this. But what the software is designed to do is to say the bigger the landslide, the more votes we shift. Right? You can't just shift. This is why it looks like, this is why it's feasible. Okay? If they were to basically say, we're going to take 300,000 votes and shift them from Trump to Biden. Well, what if Biden wins by a big margin? None of this makes sense. The software is designed to look at what is happening. As we get more and more Republican votes relative to Democrat votes, we have to move more and more of them over. We have to shift them over. And so in some very primitive fashion, because it's not terribly sophisticated, but in some fundamentally primitive fashion, this thing is feeding back. It is doing what the program is designed to do. The more Republican the vote, the more the votes shift. And as this data analyst, and I'm embarrassed I didn't write this guy's name down. They're going to get, they should all be given the Medal of Freedom, and yeah, I mean, he should run for president. But what this guy said, the data analyst said, is that there's no such thing as a computer glitch. You remember hearing they caught like 6,000 votes or 5,000 votes going from Trump to Biden? And they said, yeah, that was a glitch. Well, the data analyst said, computers don't work that way. I'm saying that computers don't decide to go out for a smoke break. And computers don't find themselves busy texting when they should be counting. There's no such thing as a glitch. If votes were moved, they were moved because a parameter ordered them to be moved. That is evidence. And there is no other explanation. And in this video, he tries as hard as he can to come up with another explanation. He specifically says, well, what if Romney's right? I mean, what if Romney's assertions are correct? What if this means that the more Republican you get, the less support that Trump has? That's what the rhinos would argue. That's what the Lincoln Club would argue. They say, look, the more Republican you get, the further to the right you go along that line, the poorer Trump does among Republicans. Below the line. But as this guy pointed out, he said, yeah, well, if that were the case, this would look like, it would look like that. If Trump was less popular among Republicans, if the red line is down the ticket Republican and people who decided to mark individual ballots, I'm going to go with Republican state senators, I'm going Republican district attorneys, Republican, but I don't like that Trump, I'm going to vote against him. Well, if this were true, you would see all of the blue dots below the line, and this graph would indicate that Trump is less popular among Republicans than the straight down the party Republican vote. If Trump were more popular, then it would look like this. If Trump's popularity was this, now let me just tell you once again what this line represents. This line represents what it would look like if the people who vote straight Republican and the people who hand fill out every single candidate feel the same way. In other words, if almost every single Republican that fills out the individual people felt the way they did about Trump, then this line would be looking just like this. This would indicate that Trump is as popular as the straight Republican vote. This means that Trump is more popular than the straight Republican vote, and this means that Trump is less popular than the straight Republican vote. But the thing that you cannot square is that he's more popular in the less Republican districts, and that line is stable. And then once you get to about 20%, all of a sudden, Donald Trump becomes less and less popular. He's doing exactly normal, right up to about 25%. And then once you get to 25%, as the vote gets more and more Republican, he is liked less and less and less, and he's liked at a linear rate, and that linear rate of increasing hatred exists through election day, early voting, and in the various different counties, which is not feasible. You look at this line, folks, look at this graph, see where that yellow line starts to crack and go down. That is where the software kicks in. That is the parameter that has been entered for each one of these individual counties that says when the vote gets to this, now start turning this thing on. Now turn it on and take votes according to the algorithm. If the Republican vote remains below 20% of that precinct, then don't touch it. But if it gets above 20%, start taking votes away from Trump. And the more Republican it gets, the more votes you need to take, to the point where if it is a 100%, everybody voted Republican, that means take all of the votes and shift them. They're done. They're cooked. He's also said that when you take a look at counties or precincts that hand count everything and don't send it in to be machine counted, they said you don't see any of this evidence. It's nice. Here's Biden's support. Here's Trump's support. And if Biden's more popular in this area, he's got a nice standard deviation along that line, and Trump is not as popular, and he gets standard deviation along this line. But you don't see cases where Trump is doing this, and then all of a sudden Trump just falls off. It just doesn't happen. So that is the smoking gun evidence, and that is the issue. Now, as Cheryl points out, there's the smoking gun, but will Biden supporters give it credence? Well, at least half of the Democrats out there undoubtedly would give it credence, but they won't ever get to hear this story. Because here was what I think is going to happen now. And I'm quite convinced this is going to be the case, although I've been wrong before. I think what's going to happen is that they're going to take this kind of statistical evidence that is absolutely incontrovertible. And they're also going to take testimonies of people who've been told to backdate ballots and all of this stuff. They're going to take it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is filled with smart people, and they are able to read statistics. If I can understand this, then they certainly can. So what I suspect is going to happen is going to be a repeat of what happened in 1876. In 1876, I want to say it was Tilden versus Rutherford B. Hayes. I'm not 100% sure about that, but that sounds right. In 1876, the national vote was considered to be so fraudulent and so compromised that they had to go to what the Constitution specifies in a case like this. The Constitution is astonishing in its elegance and its beauty. The Constitution basically says if an election, for whatever reason, is not resolved, if it's evidence of fraud or whatever the case, if it turns out that the electors can't vote because somebody rules it's just a fraudulent election, you don't vote again, the whole election essentially becomes void. And this is when the progressives start to lose their mind. But as it turns out, the Constitution has rules in favor of this. And what the Constitution says is, if the electors cannot elect a president for whatever reason, then they must immediately, that's the word used in the Constitution, immediately poll the House of Representatives. Now, you first would think, oh, that's bad, because the Democrats control the House. But that's not how the House of Representatives is polled. In this one case only, the House of Representatives is polled as the Senate. In other words, each state gets one vote. California votes one person, Rhode Island votes one person, Texas gets one vote. Each state gets one vote. Not a proportional vote, not a population weighted vote. The states elect the president, and so each state then gets to vote as if each state were an individual person. And right now, if I got the numbers correctly, there are 26 states that are red states, and there are 22 states that are blue states. Doesn't matter what the population is. So I think what's going to happen is it's going to go to the Supreme Court. Thank God for Ruth Bader Ginsburg not deciding to retire under Obama. But that means that even with swishy John Roberts, who has a special place in hell, even if Roberts flips on this, then it's a minimum of a 5-4 majority. So the Supreme Court would then say, yes, the election is compromised. Just to recap, since apparently it went offline for 2 minutes, let me recap for those of you that may have been cut off. Here's what I believe is going to happen. I believe that this kind of evidence is going to be presented to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will rule that the evidence for voter fraud is overwhelming, and they will void either individual states or they might void the whole election. This has happened before in 1876, once, where the election was so illegitimate, so much evidence of fraud, that the electors basically said no. So the Supreme Court then followed the rules of the Constitution. In 1876, they said, okay, the election is essentially tainted irrevocably. We don't vote again. We have to inaugurate a president on Inauguration Day, which used to be in April or March, I think, but now it's in January. So the Constitution has rules for this. And the rules are, if the electors cannot certify an election and come up with 270 votes because one state or more states are irretrievably compromised, then the Constitution says that the electors must immediately, meaning that hour, once they realize they cannot come with a vote for the president, then it immediately goes to the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives votes, but they do not vote proportionally. Since the states elect the president, each state, for this it's the only time this happens in my understanding, each state votes one vote. California gets a vote, Montana gets a vote. And when that happens, if the election is declared void due to fraud, then the states are polled. Each state gets one vote. And there are, in my understanding, 26 red states and 22 blue ones, which means that Donald Trump is reelected. And the left is going to howl, and the streets they're going to burn their own cities down. And now you know why they've been saying, now you know, it's 30-19. I like those odds even better. I think maybe the 2620 is a result of the last election, but whatever. But Donald Trump will be reelected, and he'll be reelected legally. And this is the most important thing. What conservatives need, what law-abiding people need, is they need the legal and constitutional justification to fight against what is going to be the will of the people, because this is all they've been hearing until after. And I don't care actually anymore. I really don't. So I think what's going to happen is it's going to go to the court. The court's going to invalidate the election. It's going to go to the House of Representatives. The House is going to vote one state. Trump will be reelected. He'll become president. He will get the second term. All of the people who are now out on the streets voting or celebrating for Biden are going to be rather upset. The media will lose their minds. They'll call it a coup. They'll call it a dictatorship. They'll call it all of these things. That doesn't matter to us. If it turns out that all of this is not only legal but constitutional, then now we fight on this one. We fight on this hill and fight and die here. The media has been making every effort to make it clear to the American people that they are going to determine who the president is. And that's why when you look at my American Pravda video, right below it on YouTube, it says, the Associated Press has called this election for Biden. Find out how robust fact-checking, blah, blah, blah. Follow this link for more information. Ironic, isn't it, that you can follow a link to show you that the Associated Press has called the election for Biden in a video that is specifically about how the media has no power to call the election at all. I found that kind of delicious and interesting. So here's what's at stake. First of all, I hope, I'm not saying, I'm not planning on this, but I would hope, I'm sure I'll be disappointed about this one, that if this does go to the Supreme Court and this kind of evidence goes to the Supreme Court, I would like to think that we would get a unanimous decision in favor of fraud. If Sotomayor and Kagan see this kind of evidence and still say, no, there's no voter fraud, then they are hacks. And I would say the same thing about everything else. So I'm feeling much better than I did just even yesterday. Because I have spent, as I said earlier at the beginning of this, I have spent 10 days, 7 days, 8 days, trying to find ironclad evidence that I can build an argument on, and so on. And I think what we're going to find is that this stuff has been happening everywhere. It didn't happen in Florida. Florida's got its act together. I think after 2000, Florida just really got it together. Florida got their votes counted on time. They got their votes in on time. There's none of this in the Florida data. Florida data is perfect. It's like, okay, these are Biden kind of counties, yes, and then these are Trump counties. There's none of this jumping. There's no irregularities, and there's one more little ingredient to this toxic little brew, and that is, of all of the voter fraud that we're seeing everywhere, all the glitches, all the misprints, all the typos, all of this, all of that, late ballots, all of it is going in one direction. Don't you find that the most remarkable thing? That's what I find the most remarkable thing. One direction, all of it. It's all going one way. So, we law and order people need a law and order reason to resist what is coming. And what is coming is the media driving the American public into an absolute frenzy. But if the law is on our side, then we'll stand. If the law is on our side and if the law is on our side, the Supreme Court rules and the Constitution's followed, the military swears an oath to protect the Constitution of the United States. If it turns out that constitutionally Donald Trump is elected to a second term, then the military will back Trump, and so will I. And I think this explains why we haven't seen him for 4, 5, 6 days. So anyway, And by the way, you'll find these same kind of irregularities if you look at COVID-19 data. So on. People are saying there's a Trump tweet that I missed in caps. Can somebody just copy and paste that and put it in the comment section? I don't want to deal with Twitter. I have a hard time getting to Twitter. But apparently he said something in caps. So when he's in all caps, that usually means something big. Hopefully it will have something to do with this. If somebody could copy and paste it, I'd love that. There's always a 5 or 6 second delay between. Okay, here we go. Dominion deleted 2.7 million Trump votes nationwide. Data analysis finds 221,000 Pennsylvania votes switched from President Trump to Biden. 941,000 Trump votes deleted. States using Dominion voting systems switched 445,000. Oh, God damn. He's not putting out specific numbers. Dominion whistleblowers are coming out tomorrow. I saw somebody finally put up $1 million reward. That was my first thought when I saw the first whistleblower from Project Veritas. I said, why don't I'd be willing to start a GoFundMe campaign, and I think we should put up $500 million. Trump could put that up out of his own pocket, but that would be a conflict of interest looking thing, kind of thing. This guy, by the way, Shiva, is running in Massachusetts. So listen to this. If every one of the 70 million people donated $10, there'd be $750 million. You're down there right. So listen to what Shiva did. This is in the 2020 election. So Shiva is looking at the elections results coming in from Massachusetts prior to, okay? And he wants to see the ballot images. I started off by saying that a ballot, even a hand-filled ballot, is a piece of paper, and we think, oh, there's a piece of paper, and that's being archived. Yeah, but that's not what is actually being voted. That thing is being essentially photographed. It's being computer scanned, and then that goes someplace else to be voted, to be counted. And so that's the ballot. The image is the ballot now. That's the vote, is the image. It's not the paper anymore. It's the image. And since it's not the paper anymore, and it is the image which is going to a counting center, then they can do whatever they want to with those images, and they've been deleting them, and deleting them is against the law. And so Shiva said, I want to see the ballot images from the early voting or something like this. He demanded to see that from the Maine Secretary of State. He made a Freedom of Information request. So the Secretary of State from Maine contacts Twitter, calls them up, and with an election 35 days away, Twitter bans him for 21 days, bans him for 3 weeks. In the middle of an election campaign, Twitter bans him for 3 weeks, and the crime that Twitter banned him for was him saying, I want to see the ballot images. And the Secretary of State said, we got to do something about this guy, so they shut him down. Everybody, this video I've been referencing all night was a live stream kind of a thing. And so you see the comments coming in live, much as they do here. And as the comments were coming in live, everybody was saying, you got to get this to Trump, you got to get this to Trump. And I'm thinking, first of all, he probably already knows. Secondly, he's got other people on this. I mean, he's got some major people on this. I've heard somebody say, the idea that certainly the top of the FBI is corrupted, but I know many field agents in the FBI who are just embarrassed, disgusted, ashamed, and heartbroken over what Comey did to that agency. And to think that the entire FBI and the entire CIA and Homeland Security and the NSA, to think that they are all Democratic operatives is just nuts. You can make the case that the heads of those organizations are. But to say USAF Cyber Command is running the show, I've got confidence in the USAF Cyber Command. And don't you betray my confidence, USAF Cyber Command. If Trump and the USAF Cyber Command has conclusive evidence of this, not only does he get to be president, but But then you get 4 years, or at least 2 years. No, you get 4 years. You get 4 years of a Justice Department to go after all of these people. And I think, I'm not happy about this, but if you ask me about what I would do, I would dangle immunity in front of everybody. And I would dangle immunity until there was nobody left to rat out on. I would say you are looking at 20-year prison term right now. You're going to go to federal prison for 20 years for interfering in this election. However, if you testify against the person who told you to do that, then we'll give you a suspended sentence, or maybe we'll give you 2 years or whatever. But I would dangle that and dangle it and dangle it and dangle it. And so how high up does it go? Well, in this video, he pointed out that, well, we know who some of the people who own Dominion: Nancy Pelosi, Dianne Feinstein, Rupert Murdoch, Carolyn Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch, as you may remember from Fox, has got a burr about Donald Trump, and so does Carolyn Murdoch. And so you're wondering why Fox kind of glitched out, to say the least. And the thing about Fox is that influenced the vote, because every single conservative in the country was watching one network. Everybody. The 70 million people that voted for Trump were watching Fox, every one of them. No, none of us were watching anything else. And that meant that whoever controlled Fox could control the turnout for the conservatives. So, I've said before, where does this make sense? I did it in the firewall. Well, Disney owns this and this and this and so on, but the bottom line is somebody decided to ruin Fox News permanently. Fox News has disappeared. No one is watching Fox News anymore. Their ratings have cratered, 80 or 90% down. And Tucker will go someplace else, and so will a few other people. But again, you have to ask yourself serious business questions. What would cause somebody to destroy a business like that? You don't destroy a business like that for ideology. You just don't. And when you get to the level of income for people like Murdoch and stuff, you probably don't even really do it for money. You don't destroy a business for the money. The only way you would be willing to destroy Fox would be if the consequences to you were so high that if you didn't, you might go to jail. So I guess what I'm saying is, when it became clear that okay, so Dominion is doing all this voter fraud stuff, and they've got to get Trump out of office because now the investigation's starting to get close to the real people. Basically, Murdoch says, if I have to destroy Fox in order to get this election into Biden's hands so this will all go away, then that's what we'll do. And I think that's what they did. I'm never watching Fox News again, ever. And I'm going to have a real hard time watching. Tucker wasn't a part of it, but Bear, Cavuto coming in, interrupting the press secretary, saying, well, we're not going to go there. Okay. I think one of the things that filled me with the most happiness in the last 24 hours, and it's been a good 24 hours, and I think it's going to start getting better, is when I heard that Florida governor is trying to get laws passed that say that if people are rioting outside your building or your house and they're destroying your property, you have the right to shoot them dead. Glenn Reynolds said on Instapundit, he said, every civilized society in history has laws like that. You see, these idiots actually think that all of this enthusiasm is about Trump. They really think that we are like this Hitler-like cult, like all of the enthusiasm and the passion for this guy is for him. It's got essentially nothing to do with him. It's got to do with the fact that he is the first guy in living memory to stand up to this ongoing destruction of our liberties that happens when societies become too prosperous and too secure. People come, 50,000 people don't show up in the middle of the Nebraska plains because they love Donald Trump. They show up because they love the country and they love everything that it's based on. They love all of its ideas. They show up because they love the country, and they show up to support the guy who is actually fighting for that for the first time ever that I've ever seen in my adult life. And he is the guy with all of his flaws. He is the only one who understands how this thing works. He's the only one from the pop culture. He's the only one who understands how it works and has played it and is fighting about them. That tweet about Dominion, you don't make a tweet like that unless you're feeling pretty good, because he's been in there quiet. John Galt for the win. It's us thereafter. Trump's just in the way. That's one of the most profound things I've ever heard. And the guy who did the actual data analysis on those graphs I showed you with earlier said something I thought was really, really important. This is this patriot who did the data analysis on these election issues, and he said when Dr. Shiva said, "Do you have any closing thoughts?" And he said, I want to say his name is Don. I think it's Don. Anyway, I'll get it right. He said, "Yeah, I do. I do have a closing thought. My closing thought is this. This is not voter fraud. The voters didn't do this." I thought, my God, that is a profound, 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 profound observation. And that needs to be just bellowed. This isn't voter fraud. The votes went into the machine. It's control fraud. It's behind the scenes fraud. The voters didn't do anything fraudulent. People went and voted for Donald Trump or Joe Biden, and they did it with most of them did it with the idea that this was going to be how we determine things. But since we don't know what goes into the machine, we can't check it against what comes out of the machine. But it's not voter fraud. The voters did what they're supposed to do. Voters went to the polls, and whoever did the counting betrayed not only the Trump supporters, and this needs to be said too, by the way, although not many of them will see it. It still needs to be said. They didn't just cheat Trump supporters. They cheated every single person who legitimately voted for Joe Biden, and they cheated every single person who voted for Joe Biden who believes in this country. They ripped those people off too. They destroyed everybody's confidence in the system, and they did it on purpose.